Canada is the best country in the world to live in, and it is the duty of every person qualified to give Canada the best they have in the defense of their country.
One man, a rifle, a hand with a finger freshly blown off it. He climbs up out of the trench, out of the only thing keeping him alive, and stands straight up in the open, in broad daylight, with every German gun on that front able to see him. By every rule of trench warfare, every instinct of survival, he should be dead in 4 seconds. Instead, 62 enemy soldiers are about to lay down their arms and surrender to him. This is the story of how a farmer from Spirit River, Alberta, did the single most tactically reckless, and once you understand it, the single most tactically brilliant thing I have ever come across in the First World War. So let me back up. Picture a homestead shack out near Spirit River, Alberta, and I want you to really see it, because this isn't a grand place. It's a single, humble shed on a patch of bush up in the Peace Country, the far northwest of the province, where the growing season is short and the winters are long and the land does not, in any sense, want to be farmed. 2 brothers have been out here breaking that ground with their hands, clearing timber, fighting frost, fighting mud, fighting the whole stubborn northern country one season at a time. And then the word comes up the line that there's a war on, way over in Europe. Something about an archduke and Belgium and empires falling over each other like dominoes. And the story goes that the brothers do something that, if you've ever poured yourself into something that won't quite reward you, you might find weirdly, achingly relatable. They put down their tools. They decide to go and enlist. And on the door of that shack, one of them tacks up a single note. No long farewell, no explanation, just one line that tells you almost everything you need to know about the man who wrote it. It reads, "War is hell, but what is homesteading?" That's our guy. That's Chip Kerr, a farmer with a dry, dark, prairie sense of humor, walking away from one fight to go find a much bigger one. And in a little over a year and a half, on a torn-up ridge in France, in the middle of one of the worst battles in human history, this man is going to do something so tactically audacious, so completely gloriously wrong by every rule of trench fighting, that it's going to bag him 62 prisoners, capture a quarter mile of German trench, and earn him the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the entire British and Commonwealth world. He's going to do most of it after one of his fingers gets blown clean off. And then, and this is the part that gets me, he's going to escort the prisoners back under fire, report in for duty, and only then let somebody look at his hand. So today we're going to figure out how. Not just that he did it, how. The geometry of it, the tactics of it, the split-second decision that turned a stalled, bleeding little fight into a battle honor because the deed is famous. The mechanics behind it almost never get told, and the mechanics are the best part. Welcome to the 29th episode of Memory and Valor, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting the sacrifices of Canadian veterans and soldiers in the First World War. I'm your host, Samantha McCrae. Thank you for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. All right. Always a pleasure to be joining you here on the podcast. And I have to be straight with you about why this episode is a wee bit personal for me. Right now, I am doing my university practicum at the Loyal Edmonton Regiment Military Museum, and this is located in the Prince of Wales Armouries building. The regiment that museum belongs to, the Loyal Eddies, carries the direct lineage of the battalion at the dead center of today's story, the 49th, the Edmonton Regiment of the First World War. So when I talk about the 49th Battalion today, Understand that for me, this isn't some abstract block of men on a map. It's the unit whose colors and photographs and relics I walk past every time I'm there, every week. This one's home turf. This is our story here in this city of Edmonton. And here's my one promise to you, because home turf history has a trap built into it. It's easy to get sentimental, to just sort of slather the whole thing in reverence until the actual human being disappears under a layer of bronze and bunting. I'm going to try hard not to do that. And I'm going to do something else too, where the legend and the paper record disagree. And with Chip Kerr, in a couple of small places, they do. I'm going to tell you about it instead of just printing the legend, because the real story is actually better, and you deserve the verifiable version. So here's our map for the next hour. We start with the man, the logging camps, the homestead, that note, and what the enlistment papers actually say. Then the city and the remarkable man named Griesbach, who built the 49th in a matter of days. Then the battalion's real baptism of fire, and it isn't the Somme. It's a mighty hill in Belgium that we've talked about a few times before called Mount Sorrel. And it's the moment that, as it happens, opens the door for Kerr to even be in this story. Then the Somme, then Courcelette, and then the single most important morning in the history of mechanized war. And then we are going to slow all the way down and learn how trench fighting actually worked. So the grenades, the geometry, the job of a bayonet man. Because you can't understand why Kerr's move was brilliant until you understand the rule book he tore up. Then I'm going to put you in the trench with him, minute by minute, and why it mattered, and then home. Deep breath. Pull up a chair, get cozy, get a coffee, settle in. This is a long one, and it earns it. So let's go. All right, let's talk about John Chipman Kerr. That's Kerr. He's born in January in 1887, way over on the other side of this country. Fox River, Nova Scotia. He's a maritime kid, but like an enormous number of the men who'd end up out west, the East was just the starting line. The West was the destination, especially back in those days, the place a young man with no money and a strong back went to make himself into something. So Kerr goes west. And before he ever picks up a rifle, he's picking up an axe. He works as a lumberjack in the Kootenay district of British Columbia, that gorgeous, brutal mountain country in the southeast corner of that province. And hold on to this because it matters more than it seems. Logging in that era was some of the most dangerous physical labor a human being could do. Logs the size of rail cars rolling loose, no safety code worth the name. The men who did that work and survived it were a particular breed. They were strong, alert, comfortable around lethal danger in a way most of us will never be. Kerr spent years in that world. Then, in 1912, he and his brother do the classic thing. They take up a homestead, not in some gentle, fertile valley. It's up in Peace Country, near Spirit River, in the far northwest of Alberta. And if you know that part of this province, you're already nodding your head. This is the frontier of the frontier. You're not buying a farm. You're being handed a quarter section of wilderness and a dare. Clear it, break it, survive on it. Make it yours or lose it. And the two of them grind away at that for a couple of years. Now the note, the famous note, quote, "War is hell, but what is homesteading?" End quote. I love this line so much because of everything it quietly tells you. It's funny, it's fatalistic. It's a man who has clearly heard that war is supposed to be the worst thing imaginable and who looks around at his frostbitten, mud-caked homestead and goes, well, how much worse can it be, really? It's the joke of a man with no illusions about hardship, which is, of course, exactly the wrong kind of joke because he had no idea. None of them did. And this story isn't just ink in an encyclopedia. It's a living thing handed down in the family across kitchen tables for 100 years. So before we get into the records, let's hear it the way the Kerrs themselves tell it. This is Graham Kerr, Chip's grandson, interviewed by Craig Ketchum. Here he is on how it all began, how Chip and his brother Roland got the homestead in the first place, the note they left stuck to the door, and the family's picture of two brothers riding off together on horseback to go and enlist.
Him and his brother went up there when they heard they were giving away land, and they got a quarter section each right beside each other. And the rules were you had to have something built, some kind of a structure built on the property. So what they did is they built a 22 by 22 foot log cabin, and they put it right on the boundary between the two properties. So each brother slept on his own property. Roland and Chip were partners in this conglomerate. They were very close, and they traveled, and then when the war broke out, they thought, well, we better go do our part. And he nailed a piece of paper to the door of their cabin that read, "War is hell, but what is homesteading?" And he nailed that to the wall, to the door. And they got on their horses and off they went. After they signed up, there was some training, and then they shipped them off to England. And within a couple of months, they were in England.
That's the version that's been carried down for a century. The note, the homestead, two brothers on horseback, heading for the war together. It's a wonderful story, and the heart of it is absolutely true. But here's where I keep my promise to you about the legend versus the record. The popular telling, the one on the plaques and the encyclopedia pages, has the brothers reading the news in 1914 and immediately setting out for Edmonton, note on the door, off to a war that very season. It's a great image. The trouble is, the actual service record is a little less tidy. Chip Kerr's attestation paper, that's the document he signed when he formally joined up, is dated the 25th of September, 1915. More than a year after the war began, and he didn't enlist into the famous 49th directly either. According to his record, he signed on with the 66th Battalion, the Edmonton Guards, one of the later Edmonton units raised to feed reinforcements to the front, and was only afterwards sent on to the 49th. His brother's paper sits right beside his in the record, Charles Roland Kerr, attested on the 22nd of October, 1915, just under a month after Chip. And here's the small human detail that is kind of hard to stop thinking about, the kind of thing you only find when you go and look at the actual documents. The same officer's signature approves both papers. The same hand, the same pen, signing two farm brothers from Spirit River into the Army a month apart. So hang on to that thought. We're going to come back to that signature and to Raleigh before we're done. So what do we do with the gap between 1914 and those autumn 1915 dates? Honestly, we just hold it. Maybe the brothers went to Edmonton in 1914 full of intent and the timing didn't line up. The 1st Battalion's filled fast and a man could get turned away or end up waiting. Maybe the immediately is just the romance that kind of gives to a good story over a century. I'm not going to invent a bridge that I can't source. What I can tell you on paper is this. Chip Kerr signed his name on the 25th of September 1915 into the 66th Battalion, and his road to the 49th and to Courcelette ran through a training camp near Calgary called Sarcee, and then across an ocean. We'll pick that thread back up. First, the city and the battalion he was heading towards. Okay, so let's talk about Edmonton, a city going to war. And Edmonton, I have not lived here my entire life, but for most of it. And so, yeah, definitely there's a soft spot. This is my home. And so when I look at Edmonton and I look at history and I put the two together, it's interesting for sure. And in 1914, Edmonton is a young, brash, booming town. It's kind of like the gateway to the north. This was the last stop. This was as far north as you could get. about 72,000 people at that time. It was a frontier capital that's been growing like a weed, full of homesteaders and rail workers and clerks and immigrants and dreamers, and they're all convinced they've gotten in early on the next great city of the British Empire. There is swagger in the place, and when the war breaks out, that energy turns almost overnight into a recruiting fever. Enter William Antrobus Griesbach. And folks, Griesbach is a character in the fullest sense. By 1914, he's already packed about 4 lifetimes into one. He's a Boer War veteran. He went off to South Africa as a young man and came back decorated. He's a lawyer. He's a militia officer with the 19th Alberta Dragoons. And keep those Dragoons in your back pocket. They'll matter in a minute. And here's the headline. He had been the mayor of Edmonton. Elected in late 1906 at the age of 28, which made him, and still makes him to this day, the youngest mayor in the history of the city. The newspapers called him Edmonton's boy mayor. So in late 1914, the army hands this man a job. Raise a new infantry battalion in Edmonton, the 49th. Now, raising a battalion means finding roughly 1,000 men willing to sign their names, leave their lives, and march off to a war across the ocean. And Griesbach does it fast. The 49th reached its full complement in January 1915. And the recruiting drive was so quick, it's been remembered ever since, often cited as having pulled in its 1,000 men in about 8 days. 8 days in the dead of an Edmonton January, in a city of 72,000. You know, there must have been nothing else to do. We all know what Edmonton winters are like. So whatever the precise count, the speed tells you 2 things at once. It tells you something about the gravity of Griesbach as a leader, a man who could move a whole city, and it tells you something even more important about the moment. It's the rush, the certainty, the absolute conviction that this was going to be a grand, glorious, brief adventure. Over by Christmas. Get it now or miss it. They were so wrong, but you can't blame them for not knowing yet. Here's a detail people get wrong all the time, and it's important for our story, so let's nail this down because I know the question's coming. Where did these men train? And I'm going to be honest with you and completely transparent, I had this wrong for a long time. So not, as you might assume, like I did, in one of the grand stone armories you can still visit in Edmonton today, the building most people picture, the castle-like Prince of Wales Armouries. The one that today houses the very museum I'm doing my practicum in was at this point still under construction. It was called the Edmonton Drill Hall, and it didn't formally open until November 1915, by which time, as we'll see, the 49th was already across the ocean and into the line. And the older Victoria Armoury, the converted land titles building downtown, that was the home of Griesbach's old outfit, the 19th Alberta Dragoons, the cavalry, not this infantry battalion. No, the original 49th trained, get this, at the Edmonton Exhibition Grounds. So this is what we now know as Northlands. It's where we have our Klondike days. It's been called a bunch of different names, Capital X. It's by the old Coliseum building where hockey happened and some pretty awesome concerts happened. The Edmonton Exhibition Grounds. The men themselves pitched in to convert the exhibition buildings into a working military base over the winter of 1915 while they were billeted in odds and ends of lodging all over the city. There's a lovely human detail in the regimental history here. While the men were scattered around town waiting for the base to be ready, City Council donated free streetcar tickets so the soldiers could get back and forth to drill. That's the Edmonton of 1915. A whole city leaning in. By that spring, they were sharp enough to put on a drill display at the annual Spring Horse Show. Now, I should also qualify and say that the Edmonton Exhibition Grounds was also where the racetrack was, so this all comes together and makes some sense. So they called themselves simply the Edmonton Regiment. And they'd make that part of the formal name in 1916. They ran their own battalion newspaper, the 49er, which started before they'd even shipped out and kept going right through the war, full of in-jokes and rolls of honor and that particular gallows humor soldiers everywhere generate to survive. And then they were gone. The 49th embarked from Montreal in June 1915. 36 officers and very nearly 1,000 other ranks, sailing on the troop ship Maragama, landed in England, trained up, and in October 1915 crossed to France. There, they took their place in the Great Machine, the 7th Infantry Brigade of the 3rd Canadian Division. Remember that, 7th Brigade, 3rd Division. That's the formation we're tracking now. Arriving in France in late 1915 did not mean immediately charging over the top, by the way. The Western Front had settled into the long, grinding, miserable routine of trench warfare, rotations in and out of the line, raids, patrols, the daily attritional drip of shellfire and snipers and trench foot. Men died every week without anything happening that would ever make a history book. That was the texture of it. It was months of cold, wet, lethal boredom, punctuated by terror. And I don't want you to just take my word for what it felt like. So let's hear from a man who was there. This is Harry Routhier. He served with the 46th Battalion, a Saskatchewan unit that paid such a staggering price, it earned one of the grimmest nicknames of the whole war, the Suicide Battalion. Routhier was practically a kid. He was born in Chelsea, Ontario in 1899, and here's a lovely detail. His grandfather was the man who wrote the original French lyrics to O Canada. So listen to a grandson of our anthem describe one of the most ordinary, terrifying jobs of trench life, going out into no man's land on a night patrol, and the small liquid dose of courage the Army issued first.
Well, at night, you'd patrol a no man's land, and from shell hole to shell hole, and try to get close to a German post or something like that. And you just gradually took what was coming to you afterwards. They give you a shot of rum, rye, rum, always rum, or your lieutenant always had a flask of that. And if you were going over, give you, and I'll tell you, it just raised your head right up. Made your hair stand on end. It was rum. And you were raring to go. That was it. There was no fear.
A tot of rum. That was the Army's official answer to fear. A measure of overproof rum handed out before the worst job so a man could climb up and go. Hold that human-sized picture of courage in your head, because before this hour's out, we're going to watch one man find a great deal more of it than any rum ration could ever pour. In June 1916, the 49th got its first taste of the other thing, the big thing. It happened at a place called Mount Sorrel, and it's there in that catastrophe that the door opens for Chip Kerr. All right, this is a part of the story I only learned in the depth it deserves because of the museum. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment's own regimental history lays it out. And it's important because Mount Sorrel is where the 49th stops being a fresh battalion full of optimistic recruits and becomes a battalion that knows. Here's the setup. In the summer of 1916, the Canadian Corps is holding the southern shoulder of the Ypres salient in Belgium. This is a notorious, blood-soaked bulge in the line, overlooked on three sides by German artillery. And there's a piece of high ground there called Mount Sorrel and the neighboring hills around Sanctuary Wood. That's one of the last bits of commanding terrain in the area still in British and Canadian hands. Whoever holds the high ground sees everything. The Germans wanted it, partly for the observation and partly to draw Allied attention away from the giant offensive everyone knew was being prepared down south on the Somme. The 3rd Canadian Division, which is Kerr's future division, a brand new formation, was holding that ground. On the 2nd of June 1916, the Germans opened up with one of the most savage bombardments Canadian troops had endured up to that point in the war, an absolute storm of steel. It just erased the forward positions, hundreds of men killed in the opening hours, and in a stroke of catastrophic bad luck, the commander of the entire 3rd Canadian Division, Major General Malcolm Mercer, happened to be up at the front line when the barrage came down, and he was hit, mortally wounded that day, and he died of his wounds. The divisional commander killed. Senior officers all around him killed or wounded. The division was, in a single morning, decapitated. And then the German infantry came forward and took the high ground. So this is an absolute disaster. And into the chaos steps the 49th. They just come out of the line for a rest, barely a day of it. When they were hauled back, marching in scattered order through heavy long-range shelling toward the front, into a situation where the chain of command above had partly ceased to exist. And here's where Griesbach earns his keep. With so many senior officers dead or wounded, Colonel Griesbach, the boy mayor, was handed command of a hastily thrown together counterattack. His 49th, plus a couple of other battalions, ordered into the breach. It was a brutal, grinding business. The first counterattacks couldn't fully restore the line. It would take until the 13th of June when General Arthur Currie's 1st Canadian Division mounted a careful, methodical set-piece attack. And this, of course, was meticulously planned. The artillery and infantry timed together so that the shell fire lifted off the German trenches at the precise moment the Canadians arrived on top of them to take the ground back for good. And General Byng was in there as well. He wanted to go a little more quickly with the counterattack, and Currie said, hey, hang on, we got a plan. And that's what Currie was famous for. Historians often point to that June 13th attack as the genesis of a distinctly Canadian way of war. Patience, preparation, and the surgical coordination of guns and men. The Corps was beginning to learn its trade. Now, here's the number that stops me cold. When the 49th Battalion was finally relieved on the 5th of June, when they marched out of that fight, the regimental history records that just 4 officers and 260 men were able to march out. 4 officers, 260 men, out of a battalion that fielded somewhere around 1,000. That's what the 49th lost in its first major battle on that Belgian hill most Canadians today have never heard of. And maybe this is why I've talked about Mount Sorrel so many times. It involves the 49th, it involves the PPCLI. It's such a Canadian battle. It was the first place that Canadians ever witnessed or experienced with their eyes flamethrowers. Like, a lot happened at Mount Sorrel, and I think that's why I keep kind of coming back to it. And so the 49th Battalion did the only thing an army can do. It rebuilt. It took in big reinforcement drafts to fill the gaps left by the dead and the wounded, including hundreds of men drawn from the newer Edmonton battalions raised back home. And that, finally, is where Chip Kerr walks into this story for real. Remember the thread we left dangling? Kerr attested in late September 1915 in the 66th Battalion, the Edmonton Guards. And the 66th, like a lot of those second wave units, did its training not in Edmonton, but down at Sarcee Camp, the big military camp on the prairie just outside Calgary, the same camp where battalions whitewashed giant numbers into the hillside that you can still find traces of today above Calgary. He trained through the winter, shipped to England in the spring of 1916, and then the 66th, like so many of those reinforcement battalions, was broken up in England, its men parceled out to the units at the front that needed bodies. And here's where the timing gives me chills. Now that we know the exact date, Kerr was taken on strength by the 49th, officially drafted into its roles in June 1916. That month, the very month the battalion was being torn apart at Mount Sorrel. The regiment's own magazine, the 49er, remember the one they'd been printing since before they shipped out, put it in a single flat line years later, in 1933. Quote, on the 66th being broken up, he was drafted to the 49th in June 1916, End quote. So picture the actual sequence. The 49th marches out of Mount Sorrel with 4 officers and 260 men, and in that same stretch of weeks, a homesteader from Spirit River, fresh off the boat and the Sarcee Parade Square, walks in to take a dead or wounded man's place in the ranks. I want you to feel the weight of that because it changes how you hear everything that follows. Chip Kerr was not some grizzled original who'd been with the 49th since the Edmonton exhibition grounds. He was a brand new arrival, a reinforcement who joined a hollowed-out, grieving battalion in June 1916, and had been with them barely 3 months when they were fed into the Battle of the Somme. He'd scarcely had time to learn his comrades' names. And within those 3 months, he would do the thing that puts his name on a mountain. So when the 49th goes to Courcelette that September, keep this in mind. A battalion bled white once already and refilled, and a quiet, dry-humored new man from the Peace Country freshly arrived about to become the most important soldier on his stretch of the front. Let's go south. Okay, the Somme. I'll do this fast and human because you've probably absorbed the broad strokes, and I refuse to bury our farmer under a mountain of statistics, but you do need the shape. The Battle of the Somme begins on the 1st of July 1916. In conception, it's the great Anglo-French effort to finally break the deadlock, to smash through the German lines in one massive set-piece push. The British plan rests on a colossal week-long artillery bombardment meant to obliterate the German trenches and cut the wire, after which the infantry will essentially walk across no man's land and occupy the rubble. It does not go that way. The first day of the Somme becomes the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army, on the order of 60,000 casualties in one day. The bombardment hadn't done what it promised. The wire wasn't cut everywhere. The deep German dugouts had survived, and when the British infantry rose and advanced in their long, deliberate lines, German machine gunners climbed up out of their bunkers and cut them down in swaths. And here's the trouble with a number like 60,000. It's so enormous, it stops meaning anything. You can't feel it. So instead of me reciting statistics at you, let's stand in it for a minute. 3 voices, 3 angles on the same morning. Real men recorded decades later, still carrying it. First, we're going to hear from Roy Henley, a Canadian born in London, Ontario in 1898. And he points at something most people never picture, that the German wire wasn't just a barrier to climb. It was designed, it was laid out to funnel attacking men like cattle in a chute straight into the waiting machine guns.
The German was a good fighter. When he put his wire up, he put the weak places on what we call the knife wire, which was a movable section, like 2 crossbars, or 2 sets of crossbars with wired that could be lifted and opened up. He used it simply as a killing ground and just mowed them down. Bravery doesn't mean anything. Haig made the statement one time, the machine gun is highly overrated. For weeks afterwards, you could see the bare bones of the Highland regiments laying on the wire with the kilts. We went down to the Somme. It was hot. It was getting hot, and the dead had been laying on the wire for about 4 days. They laid on and they rotted.
Absolutely horrific. Now remember the promise that was made to the men, a week of bombardment to cut that wire and smash those guns. Here is a British Lewis gunner named Ernest Bryan who got his team across no man's land and found out up close exactly how much of that promise had come true.
The majority of their wire wasn't cut at all, not by our artillery at all, not even by our trench mortars. So what happened? All those in there's no riflemen, but there was machine gunners. And when I talk machine gunners, I don't mean Lewis gunners. machine guns, well, static machine guns. You could fire 250 rounds in one belt. First thing I did, put my gun under my shoulder, and I sprayed the top. The German gunner went down, whether he was hit or not, I didn't know, and I didn't care. He was down. They were all down.
They were all down. That's the attacker's view. One savage, lucky little victory inside a catastrophe. Now flip it around completely. Here's that same morning from the other side of the wire. A German soldier, Stefan Westman. On the moment, the British guns lifted and his machine gunners came up out of the deep dugouts.
And then the British army went over the top. The very moment we felt that the British artillery fire was directed against the reserve positions, machine gunners, German machine gunners, crawled out of the bunkers, reddened eyes, sunken eyes, dirty, full of blood from the blood of their fallen comrades, and opened up terrific fire. The British army had horrible losses.
Listen to exactly what Westman just said, because it's the secret machinery of this entire war. The moment the artillery lifted off the front line, that's when his gunners crawled up and opened fire despite their own physical conditions. There it is. As the bombardment stops, the infantry start walking, and in that fatal little gap, the defenders climb up out of the earth and reach their guns first. That gap, the seconds between shelling ends and infantry arrives, is what killed 60,000 men in a day. And 2 months later, at Courcelette, the Canadians are going to go forward with a pair of brand new ideas built to make sure that gap never opens up again. And then, this is the part that defies comprehension, the battle doesn't stop. It grinds on for months, July into August, into the autumn mud, the very definition of attritional industrial slaughter. Yards of churned earth traded for rivers of men. That's how long this umbrella battle, the Battle of the Somme, went on, and the battle at Courcelette was part of that. Now, when we talk about the Battle of the Somme in its entirety, the Canadians miss the opening of it. Through that summer, they're up north fighting and bleeding at places like Mount Sorrel, as we just heard. But by early September 1916, the Canadian Corps, now under the British Lieutenant General Sir Julian Byng, a commander the Canadians came to genuinely respect, is moved south and fed into the Somme. Their first major action there carries a slightly awkward double-barreled name, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, fought from the 15th to the 22nd of September. The Canadian piece of it, everybody just calls Courcelette, after the fortified French village that was a key objective, a village guarded by a German strongpoint built around the ruins of a sugar refinery. And the strategic mood by this point is one of near desperation. After 2.5 months of catastrophic casualties for almost nothing, the Allied High Command is reaching for anything that might finally crack the line. And on the morning of the 15th of September at Courcelette, they reach for 2 new things at once. The first new thing is the tank. This is it, the world's combat debut of the tank, and I am going to dedicate an entire podcast episode to the tank at a later date because it's very interesting. The British had been developing them in total secrecy, calling them land ships to disguise what they were, and the early ones were frankly a mess. They were slow. They crawled at about the pace of a walking man. Mechanically, they were unreliable. They broke down constantly. They threw their tracks and they overheated. Their armor was thin enough that a direct hit from a field gun popped them open. Of the handful meant to support the Canadians at Courcelette, only a few even reached their start lines because most broke down or were knocked out almost immediately. But the idea of them, imagine this is the part I just tell over again. Imagine you're a German infantryman in the fall of 1916. You've seen everything this war can throw at you. And then out of the dawn murk comes this enormous lumbering steel monster, impervious to your rifle fire, crawling straight at your trench. There's a recorded tendency for defenders to simply break, to surrender at the sight of a thing that should not exist. A lot of German infantrymen, they threw down their guns, put their hands up, turned, and ran. One of the tanks that supported the Canadians at Courcelette, it was a Mark I nicknamed Crème de Menthe. Not even joking. They were named after alcohols. But anyway, Crème de Menthe was among the more successful, lurching forward and helping crush a fortified position. The military effect of the tanks that day was modest. The psychological effect, and file this word away because it's going to come roaring back when we get to Kerr, was enormous. Men surrendered not because they were actually beaten, but because they believed they were. They were scared to death. The second new thing is subtler and arguably more important to the day's success. It was the creeping barrage, and we've talked about this lots of times. Now, a careful word here because people overstate this. The creeping barrage was not invented at Courcelette out of nothing. The British had been developing the technique through 1916. They borrowed it from the French. But Courcelette is one of its important early showcases for the Canadians, and it's worth understanding exactly why it was such a leap, because it's the antidote to the disaster of July 1st. On July 1st, exactly as Westman described it to us a moment ago, you bombarded the enemy trenches, then you stopped, then you sent your men walking forward. And in that gap between barrage stops and infantry arrives, the German gunners popped up out of their dugouts, reached their machine guns, and massacred the advancing lines. The creeping barrage solves this with a beautiful, terrible piece of choreography. Instead of bombarding and then stopping, the artillery lays down, if you can kind of imagine like a moving curtain of shell fire that creeps forward at the preset pace. They used this at Vimy, and it was amazingly successful. So the preset pace, say 100 yards every few minutes, and the infantry advance right behind it, hugging that wall of explosions like a moving shield very carefully. The idea is that the curtain arrives on the German trench and then lifts and then rolls beyond it at the exact moment your men come over the parapet on top of the defenders before Westman's gunners can get up out of the ground. So timing is really everything. Get it right and you're in the trenches before they can kill you. Get it wrong if the barrage lifts too early, leaving that fatal gap and men die in it, as some did even at Courcelette. Now, on the morning of the 15th September 1916, the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Divisions went in at 6:20 a.m. behind that barrage, and largely it worked. They overran the German forward trenches and took the fortified sugar factory within a couple of hours. And then the village of Courcelette itself was taken and, crucially, held against ferocious German counterattacks in no small part by the men of the 22nd Battalion, the famous French-Canadian Vendus, who clung to that rubble through a storm of shell fire. This is the Canadian Corps learning its trade in real time. But here's the thing about taking a trench that nobody tells you in school. Taking the front line is just the opening move. Behind that first trench, there is a second and a third, all connected by communication trenches running back. And the Germans don't simply pack up and leave, they counterattack. They always counterattack. They bomb their way back up the trenches, they cling to the next line and make you pay for every yard all over again. So the fighting after the 15th, the 16th, the days following, becomes a grinding, vicious, close quarters business of clearing and holding the German trench systems beyond the captured village. That, finally, is the day, September 16th, that Private Chip Kerr goes to work. The 3rd Division, his division, pushing up the German trench system. But before we climb down into that trench with him, we have to do the thing I've been promising. We have to learn properly how a man actually fought in a trench, because everything Kerr does only makes sense once you understand the rules. So let's build this from the ground up. First, throw out the movie version. When most people picture a trench, they picture a long, straight ditch running off into the horizon. Wrong. A real, properly built trench is a zigzag. It runs in short, straight stretches called fire bays, connected by sharp angled corners called traverses. And the zigzag isn't decoration, it's engineering, a survival feature, and it works in two ways. So one, if an artillery shell lands in a fire bay, the blast and shrapnel get contained by the traverses on either side, instead of scything down 100 meters of packed men. The corners trap the violence. And two, and this is the one that matters for our story, if the enemy gets down into your trench, they can't simply stand at one end and fire straight down its length. Every traverse is basically, it's a blind corner. So fighting inside a trench becomes a series of brutal, intimate, corner-by-corner struggles where you literally cannot see what's around the next bend until you're on top of it. Now, two more pieces of vocabulary, and you actually need to kind of know these because the entire climax of our story hangs on one of them. The parapet is the bank of earth piled up on the enemy-facing side of the trench. So it's the front of your trench, the front lip, the part you fire over toward the other side. And the parados is the bank piled up on the friendly side, so behind you if you're facing forwards. The back lip of the trench is there to shield you from shells bursting behind you and to keep you from being silhouetted against the open sky for a sniper. So the front lip is the parapet, the back lip behind you is the parados. Lock parados into your brain right now. We're coming back to it, and when we do, it's the whole ball game. And then there are the dugouts, so chambers dug down into the trench walls where men shelter and sleep. The deep German dugouts on the Somme were famously elaborate, sometimes 30 feet down, which is exactly why all that British shelling on July 1st failed to kill the defenders. They simply waited it out underground and then came up when it stopped. Brilliant. Okay, so that's the terrain. Now, how do you actually attack down one of these things? Here's the part that surprises almost everybody. You do not charge with the bayonet screaming like it's a Napoleonic battlefield. The dominant weapon of trench clearing, the tool that did the work day in and day out, was the hand grenade, the bomb. Trench fighting was, more than anything else, bombing. And to understand why, let me tell you the quick, slightly insane story of how the grenade came roaring back into warfare. When the war started in 1914, the grenade was actually almost a forgotten weapon. It was an antique from the age of sailing ships, barely used in 50 years. The British Army had essentially gotten out of the grenade business in the 1870s. Nobody expected a siege war, so when the front froze into trenches and everybody suddenly desperately needed a weapon they could throw around a corner, the soldiers improvised. The early grenades were genuinely homemade horrors. Old food tins and jam pots that were packed with explosives and scrap metal and nails with a fuse you had to light by hand, often with a match or the end of a cigarette before you threw it. So say hello to the famous jam tin grenade. Things nearly as dangerous to the thrower as to the target. Premature explosions were real and a regular cause of death. By late 1915, the manufacturing finally caught up and the British and Canadians got a proper, reliable, mass-produced grenade. And this is the one Kerr's party is using. It's called the Mills bomb. It's that iron segmented sort of pineapple-shaped thing you've seen in 100 photographs, designed by a man named William Mills. It weighed roughly 1.75 pounds, so you'd prime it, hold down the safety lever, pull the pin, and throw. And after a delay, it would burst, spraying lethal fragments. They made over 75 million of them before the war was out. That single number tells you how central the grenade had become. And the Germans, they had their own iconic grenade. The stick grenade, the style hand granate, with the long wooden throwing handle. It looked like a grenade stuck to a stick. And the comparison between the two is a genuinely interesting little tactical study. The German stick grenade, because of that handle, could generally be thrown farther. The handle gave you leverage and momentum, like a lever arm. But the British Mills was the more lethal of the two up close, throwing far more fragments when it burst. The stick grenade produced less fragmentation, but a louder, more concussive bang with its own value as a shock and morale weapon. Okay, so you have all of this together. You've got basically the grenades are king of the trench when it comes to artillery. It's the thing that you're going to use to attack it. If you've got Germans inside your trench and you've got a furious fight on your hands. And trench attacks weren't run by random groups of men. They were run by specialist teams called bombing parties. The standard team in a bombing party ran about 9 men. Every man with a job. So at the head, you had an NCO, which is a non-commissioned officer. He was running the show, making the calls. You had 2 grenade throwers, and you had 2 carriers whose entire job was to feed a constant fresh supply of grenades up to the throwers. And a couple of men in reserve, they were spares ready to step in just in case. And then at the very front, at the tip of the spear, 2 bayonet men. And this is Chip Kerr's job. So lean in. The training manual on the employment of bombers is wonderfully specific about the bayonet men. They were to be specially picked for pluck and alertness. Good snapshots, quick, accurate shots without time to aim, handy and aggressive with the bayonet, and their role was to go first, out ahead of the throwers, and work around each traverse in turn. Each blind corner, the bayonet men cleared it, rounding the bend, dealing with whatever was there, with rifle and bayonet, and shielding the precious throwers behind them. The manual says one more thing about the bayonet men that I swear gives me chills every time, knowing what's coming. It says it falls principally to the bayonet men to, quote, prevent the fighting becoming a mere grenade duel. End quote. Because the grenade duel is the great trap of this kind of fighting. It's a failure state, a place where it all bogs down into a slaughterhouse with no result. So picture it, 2 bombing parties, one on each side of a traverse, both hunkered down, both just lobbing grenades back and forth over the corner. Neither side can advance because to advance means stepping into the open where the other guy's bombs are landing. So they just stand there and bleed, trading bombs, trading lives, burning through their supply with nothing to show for it, stalemate by attrition in miniature. And the bayonet man's job, his entire reason for existing in that party, is to be the man with the nerve to break that deadlock, to force the issue and get things moving again. So now you have all of it. You know the zigzag and the blind traverses. You know the parados waiting at the back. You know the Mills bombs. The German stick grenade can outthrow you. You know the throwers burn through bombs at a furious rate and depend on carriers to keep them fed. And you know that the man at the very front, the bayonet man, is the one specifically charged with making sure the fight never stalls into a mere grenade duel. Load every bit of that into the chamber. Now, before I tell you what Chip Kerr did, I want to read you something. This is the official version. This is the citation that ran in the London Gazette on the 26th of October, 1916. The dry, clipped, bloodless prose of the Empire formally recording why this man was given the highest decoration it had to give. Listen to how flat it is, and then we'll find out what's exactly hiding inside these 4 little paragraphs. London Gazette, number 29802, 26 October 1916. Quote, for most conspicuous bravery, during a bombing attack, he was acting as bayonet man and, knowing that bombs were running short, he ran along the parados under heavy fire until he was in close contact with the enemy, when he opened fire on them at point-blank range and inflicted heavy loss. The enemy, thinking they were surrounded, surrendered. 62 prisoners were taken and 250 yards of enemy trench captured. Before carrying out this very plucky act, one of Private Kerr's fingers had been blown off by a bomb. Later, with 2 other men, he escorted back the prisoners under fire and then returned to report himself for duty before having his wound dressed. End quote. That's it. That's the whole thing. A little over 100 words. Ran along the parados, inflicted heavy loss, this very plucky act. Plucky, like he'd won a sack race. A finger blown off gets a subordinate clause. The British Army was constitutionally incapable of using a dramatic adjective, and somehow that makes it land harder. All that violence and decision and terror folded up and filed away in the passive voice. But the Gazette wasn't the only place this story got told. Chip Kerr had his own version, and he didn't tell it in the official prose. He told it the way old soldiers do, plainly, sparingly, at his own kitchen table, to the people who loved him. Here's his grandson, Graham Kerr, again with Craig Ketchum, on how the old man himself described the day he won the Victoria Cross.
Now, my granddad was kind of impatient. We had a short fuse, which got him into a few scraps throughout his life. And they're in the trench, and they've been sitting in the trench for, let's say, 2 weeks. And they're up to their knees in mud. And every time you poked your head up to get a breath of fresh air, somebody take a shot at you. How it was explained over the kitchen table was him and his buddy decided to go visit the Germans. And so they crawled out, and they crawled across what they call no man's land, which is a stretch of land between the two trenches. And so you're going under barbed wire, and you're going in foxholes, and you're going over and under through all the mud. And they got up to where he could hear the Germans talking. And he looked around to his friend to decide what they're going to do next. And his friend had turned around and gone back because his gun was full of mud. And so he's out there all by himself. He decided, well, I've come this far. And so he crawled a little further until he got up to close to the parapet, the edge of the trench, the German trench, and he stood up and he started shooting. The Germans were kind of shocked at this. 62 of them surrendered. They just threw up their hands and said, we're finished. And they'd had enough of that trench probably anyway. So anyway, they surrendered. And so he motioned them to get out of the trench and start marching back. And all this time, there's other German infantry shooting at him, but he's not getting hit. And him and two other guys ran over. When they saw what was going on, they got out of the trench and came to give him a hand. So they marched these 62 Germans back to their trench. And that stretch of German trench, 250 to 300 yards of it, they captured it, which was a real boost because, well, things weren't going well anyway for the English and Canadian troops. So this was a real win, as it were.
So now you've got two tellings of the same 60 seconds. The king's bloodless paragraph and a grandfather's plain-spoken kitchen table version. And here's the thing. The truth of what actually happened in that trench is hiding in the gap between them, in everything both the Gazette and the modest old man left out. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to take that little flat paragraph and the quiet family story and try to unfold them, because after everything we just learned about trenches and bombs and bayonet men, you finally have the tools to see what's really inside. Let's go to the 16th of September, 1916, the day after the famous day. Near Courcelette, in the German trench system beyond the captured village, the 49th, the Edmonton men, are doing exactly the work we just spent 20 minutes learning about. They're bombing their way up an enemy trench. Push to a traverse, clear the bay, throw. Push to the next traverse, repeat. Yard by yard, corner by corner, up the zigzag. And Chip Kerr is the first bayonet man, the very tip of the spear. He's at the absolute front of his bombing party, ahead of the throwers, ahead of the carriers, the man rounding each blind corner first, the man everything depends on. This new arrival, this homesteader who'd been on the battalion's rolls barely 3 months, and the fight is hard. It's not a tank-induced collapse. The defenders here are fighting for every single traverse. The citation's word is vigorously. Bombs flying back and forth over the corners, loud beyond description. The air would have been full of dirt and smoke and the crack and thump of grenades, and it's grinding down, traverse by bloody traverse, toward exactly the thing that the bayonet man exists to prevent, the mere grenade duel. And then two things happen almost on top of each other, and either one would, for most men, be the end of their part in this war. The first, a German bomb bursts close enough to take off one of Kerr's fingers, blown off of the joint. His hand is wrecked and bleeding. Let me be a plain human being for a second, because we owe him that. A grenade has just gone off an arm's length from your body and removed part of your hand. The reasonable response, the sane response, the one no person on earth would criticize, is you're done. You're wounded. You turn around, you go back, you find a stretcher bearer, you get that hand dressed before you bleed out. You've already done more than enough. Nobody would say a word. That's not what Chip Kerr does. The second thing, almost simultaneously, word comes that the bombing party is running short on bombs. The throwers have been burning through the supply in that furious trench fight rate. The carriers can't keep up, and the team is grinding toward empty. And you know exactly what that means now, because we built it together. If you run out of bombs in a grenade duel, you lose. You can't outthrow them. The momentum dies right there in the dirt. The attack stalls, and a stalled attack, half in and half out of an enemy trench, gets counterattacked and wiped out. So picture the full situation. John Chipman Kerr is the first bayonet man. His hand is shot to pieces. His party is nearly out of grenades. The Germans are ahead, resisting hard, and can probably outrange the few bombs Kerr's side has left. By every normal measure, this little fight is about to fail. And this exact moment, is when Chip Kerr does the thing that makes him immortal. He doesn't stay down in the trench and try to win a bombing match he can't win. He does not let it become a mere grenade duel, the precise failure his entire job exists to prevent. Instead, he does something that violates every instinct of self-preservation, every rule about cover, and every reason the trench exists in the first place. He climbs out of the trench. He goes up onto the parados. The back lip, the rear bank, the single most exposed place a human being can be on that battlefield. Up there, Kerr is out of the protective slot of the trench entirely. He's standing in the open in broad daylight, under heavy fire, with nothing between him and every German weapon on that front. No cover. The whole reason you live your life crouched in a trench is to never be where Kerr just deliberately put himself. And then he runs. Along the top of the parados, a considerable distance. The records put him around 30 meters ahead of his comrades, running parallel to the trench line, above and behind the very Germans his party had been dueling with around the traverse. Now, think about what that does to the geometry, to everything we've built. The entire German defense was built around blind traverses. The zigzag was their shield. They couldn't be seen around the corners. They couldn't be flanked along the trench. Every bend protected them from the men bombing up toward them. The whole system was designed to make a frontal trench assault grind to a bloody halt, which is exactly what it was doing. And Chip Kerr just went over the top of the entire problem. He's no longer playing the trenches game. He's not rounding the traverses one agonizing corner at a time. He's above it all, looking down into the German trench from behind, from an angle where none of their corners help them, where all that careful zigzag engineering is suddenly worth nothing. Their cover is meaningless to a man shooting down into the trench from the rear lip. He opens fire, point blank, straight down into them, and the citation doesn't soften it. He kills and wounds many of them, firing into a packed trench at a range where he cannot miss. And here's where the tactics and the psychology fuse into one decisive moment. The Germans in that trench cannot see how many men just appeared above and behind them. They can't see that it's just one man, one farmer from Spirit River, Alberta, with a ruined hand and a rifle. All they know is that the geometry is just flipped. They're suddenly taking fire from a direction that's supposed to be impossible, from their own rear, from above, from behind the line that was protecting them. And there's only one conclusion that fits. We've been flanked. They've gotten behind us. We're surrounded. It's over. So Kerr did not have a battalion up on that parados with him. He had it himself, but he manufactured the perception of a collapsed flank, the impression of encirclement, and the perception was enough. More than enough. The Germans stop fighting. They surrender. 62 prisoners, around 250 yards of German trench taken by a bombing party that 60 seconds earlier was nearly out of grenades and about to fail, broken wide open by one wounded man who climbed into the deadliest open ground on the battlefield and refused to let the duel stand. And then, because the story apparently isn't finished proving exactly what kind of man we're dealing with, Kerr still doesn't go get his hand looked at. With 2 other men, he escorts the 62 prisoners back, under fire, herded back across contested ground while the shells and the bullets are still flying. He delivers them. Then he reports himself for duty. as if to ask what's next. And then, finally, only then, he let somebody dress the wound where his finger used to be. It was a plucky act. And here's a detail worth knowing, because the original recommendation that worked its way up the chain, the fuller version preserved in the regiment's own records, adds a line the Gazette trimmed away. And it's the one I think is the truest sentence anybody wrote about that day. That Kerr's action, quote, at this juncture undoubtedly resulted in the taking of the enemy trench, thereby making it possible for his battalion to occupy and hold the ground gained in the general attack, end quote. That regimental version, for what it's worth, counts the trench at 256 yards rather than the Gazette's round 250. The kind of small discrepancy you get when a deed is written up more than once. So that's the real measure of it. Bravery that was tactically decisive. It broke a stalemate. It took the trench. It let the Edmonton men hold what they'd bled for. It worked. Kerr was invested with the Victoria Cross by King George V at Buckingham Palace early the following year. For about 60 seconds up on that parado, John Chipman Kerr was the best tactician on that piece of Western Front. And he was a logger and a homesteader from the Peace Country, originally from Nova Scotia, who 4 years earlier had been arguing with frost and stumps near Spirit River. And just a few months before that had been a brand new reinforcement learning his way around a battalion full of strangers. That's the thing I can't get over. The war didn't need him to be a trained staff officer. It needed him to be exactly what he already was. Alert, fearless, comfortable around lethal danger, possessed of a certain stubborn refusal to accept that a thing couldn't be done. The same qualities that kept him alive in a logging camp and carved a homestead out of the bush are the qualities that flipped a trench at Courcelette. War is hell, but what is homesteading? Same shrug, same man, just a quarter mile of enemy trench instead of a quarter section of bush. So what happens to him? The medal is the famous part, but the life is the human part, and the human part includes a cost. Kerr survives the action, which, given that he made a habit of standing exactly where the bullets were thickest, is its own small miracle. His hand is badly wounded, and that injury complicates the rest of his war. But the Kerr family does not get through this war whole. Remember the brother. Remember that there were two of them out on that homestead near Spirit River. And remember that signature, the one officer's hand that signed both their papers a month apart in the fall of 1915. Charles Roland Kerr went to the 49th too, and Roland was killed in late December of 1917. Two brothers, one homestead, one dark little joke on a shed door, two attestation papers signed by the same pen, and one of them comes home with a Victoria Cross and a missing finger, and the other one doesn't come home at all. That's the cost that sits quietly behind the medal. The cross is the bright object in the glass case. Raleigh, or Roland, left in France is the price. And there were prices like that paid in homes all across Edmonton, all across the West. The 49th, remember, marched out of one battle, Mount Sorrel, with 4 officers and 260 men. Multiply that grief by a city, by a nation. After the war, Chip Kerr goes home to Alberta and does the most quietly Albertan thing imaginable. He goes back to the land, more or less the way so many of these men did. He farms, he works in the oil patch, he works as a forest ranger out in the bush watching for fires, the highest decoration the Empire can give. And the man wearing it is checking for smoke in the Alberta forest. And then, and I genuinely love this, when the Second World War breaks out, Chip Kerr, now a man in his 50s, enlists again. This time he ends up in the Royal Canadian Air Force, posted out to Sea Island in British Columbia. The man simply could not be kept out of it. Twice his country went to war, and twice this farmer raised his hand. He moved to Port Moody, British Columbia in 1947, and died there in 1963. His Victoria Cross, the actual medal, cast in bronze, engraved simply for valor, is held today at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, where you can go and stand in front of it. He's often counted as the 21st Canadian to receive it, and his name is up in the mountains. There's a peak named Mount Kerr, and here's the perfect part. It sits in the range in Jasper National Park called the Victoria Cross Ranges, where the peaks are named for VC recipients. It was named in his honor in 1951. There's also a park named for him out in Port Moody, dedicated in 2006. A homesteader turned into a mountain. And I can't end with just Kerr, because the 49th, our battalion, has one more piece to this, and it brings us all the way home. The 49th Battalion produced not one, but two Victoria Cross winners in the Great War. The first you know now intimately, Chip Kerr at Courcelette in September 1916. The second was Private Cecil John Kinross, and the symmetry is almost uncanny, including in the part that surprises people. Kinross was English-born, came over from Harefield near London, but like Kerr, he came west, moving with his family to Lougheed, Alberta, in 1912 to a farm. Another Western farm boy. And here's the part that mirrors Kerr exactly. Kinross didn't train in Edmonton with the original 49th either. He enlisted down in Calgary in October 1915 into the 51st Battalion, which, like Kerr's 66, did its training at Sarcy Camp, and only reached the 49th later as a reinforcement in France in early 1916. Both of the battalion's Great War VCs, and neither of them was an original Edmonton man. Both came up through the second wave battalions and the Calgary training camp and joined the 49th to fill the ranks. There's something quietly true about that, about how an army actually gets rebuilt and carried by the steady stream of reinforcements whose names nobody learns until one of them does something extraordinary. On the 30th of October, 1917, at the Battle of Passchendaele, that infamous drowning, mud-choking nightmare in Belgium, Kinross's company got pinned down. The advance halted by a German machine gun pouring fire into them, casualties mounting. Kinross did something that should sound deeply familiar by now. He made, the citation says, a careful survey of the situation. He coldly stripped himself of all his equipment except his rifle and bandolier of ammunition, shedding everything that would slow him down, and then he advanced alone, over open ground in broad daylight, straight at that machine gun. He killed the entire crew of 6. He destroyed the gun, and his action so electrified his company that they pushed forward another 300 yards and seized a vital position. I also want to add in here that on October 30th, 1917, in that same spot, in the same 49th Battalion, was where my very close friend John MacDonald's grandfather, Huey John MacDonald, the runner, earned his military medal. Same battalion, same kind of man, and very nearly the same insight, that on this battlefield, sometimes a single man acting with cold deliberation and a total disregard for his own safety could unlock a situation that stopped an entire company. Kinross was badly wounded, shell wounds to the arm and the head, and received his Victoria Cross from King George V in early 1918. 2 Victoria Crosses in one battalion is a genuinely remarkable thing. The Victoria Cross was created in 1856 by Queen Victoria for most conspicuous bravery in the face of the enemy, and in all the time since, across every war the British and Commonwealth forces have fought, from Crimea to today, it has been awarded only somewhere in the order of 1,350 times, ever. And one infantry battalion raised in 8 days out of a prairie city of 72,000 people holds 2 of them. Chip Kerr at Courcelette, Cecil Kinross at Passchendaele. 2 Western farm boys, 2 reinforcements who walked into the 49th Battalion as strangers, who each looked at an impossible situation, stripped down to a rifle, and went forward alone. 2 Edmonton Battalion privates, 2 Victoria Crosses, and both fittingly have peaks named for them in those same Victoria Cross ranges in Jasper. Mount Kerr and Mount Kinross, both christened in 1951, standing not far apart in the Rockies. So you have 2 farm boys turned into mountains. And here's where I bring it all the way home, because I promised you this one was home turf. The 49th Battalion was disbanded in 1920, but its story didn't end there. Its lineage, its battle honors, its identity, all of it lives on today in the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Loyal Eddies, and the museum where I'm doing my practicum, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment Military Museum is the keeper of it all, of Kerr, of Kinross, of Griesbach, and his record-fast recruiting, and his 1,000 farmers and clerks. And here's a detail with a beautiful twist now that we've done our homework. The museum sits inside the Prince of Wales Armouries, that grand castle-like building that, as we learned, opened as the Edmonton Drill Hall in late 1915. So neither Kerr nor Kinross ever trained there. The building wasn't even quite finished when the original 49th shipped out, and these two men came up through Calgary and Sarcee. But that's almost the point. The building outlived the war, outlived the men, and became the place where their story is kept, where Kinross's miniature Victoria Cross sits in a case you can walk up to today. The armory didn't make them, it remembers them. And I think there's something right about that. So picture the whole arc. A logger and a homesteader from Peace Country signs his name in Edmonton in the autumn of 1915. He trains on the prairie outside Calgary. He crosses an ocean. He joins a battalion that's just been bled white on a Belgian hill, walking in among strangers to fill a dead man's place. And a few months later, on a torn-up ridge in France, with his hand blown half off and his party out of bombs, he climbs out of a trench onto the most dangerous ground on earth. War is hell. He thought he knew that, with that dry joke on the shed door. He didn't. Not yet. None of them did. But the thing Chip Kerr seemed to understand all the way down in his bones is the thing this whole episode has really been about. It isn't the hell that defines you. It's what you do in the middle of it. In the 60 seconds when everyone else is rightly keeping their head down and the bombs are running short and there's every reason in the world to quit. He went over the top of the problem. Thank you so much for spending this hour and a bit with me and with John Chipman Kerr. It's been an absolute pleasure to relate this story to you, and I tell it with pride, I tell it with fascination. As always, the incredible things that these men did should never be forgotten. If you're in Edmonton, come by the museum. Stand in front of the display cases. These were our neighbors. And remember, keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on. I'll see you next time.